Ripper, the police were no closer to catching the killer. And inside the files of the forensic pathologist lay post-mortem reports on 10 murdered women. People in West Yorkshire began to lose faith in the police.
Before Sutcliffe was caught, I think the majority of people thought the West Yorkshire police were a load of rubbish.
The Ripper case was the largest, the most significant, the most demanding terms in manpower that had ever happened in this country. And I don't think the police service were geared to taking on such a long, hard, difficult inquiry that affected the health and well-being of so many officers.
Three more women were to die. 3 women whose brutal deaths might have been prevented, but for fatal mistakes made by the police during the biggest manhunt in British criminal history.
As I was walking down, I felt somebody behind me, and then I noticed a shadow, and then it hit me from behind and I went down.
I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but the Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started.
In the summer of 1979, the manhunt moved northeast to the banks of the River Wear. A man with a Sunderland accent had sent a tape claiming to be the Ripper. Police called in Stanley Ellis, an expert on regional dialects, to pinpoint the origin of the voice.
Well, you see, north of the river distinguishes itself because although it's not Geordie, it's still Wearside. There are some Geordie elements beginning to creep in. September, October. That was a bit more of the Newcastle kind than October that you'd expect to get in Sunderland. It was all, as I say, impressionistic, but it did seem to me that this area, Castletown, was the one that I had the best match.
I warned you in March that I'd strike again. Sorry it wasn't worth it. I did promise you that.
The pit village of Castletown found itself suspected of harbouring Britain's most wanted killer.
I'm not quite sure when I'll strike again, but it will be definitely sometime this year, maybe September, October.
The Northumbria police arrived in force.
We set up in what was on the main street, just playing the tape, walking around with clipboards, talking to everyone and anyone, trying to attract a crowd. I listened to it at Castletown. We played it to everybody we met. We invited people to come in. It was on the loud hailers all the time from the porter cabin. When I went to the incident room, which I was there for over a year,
Do you know the registration
the tape was played continually to people phoning up asking them to listen to it. And it was playing all the time in your background when you were, whatever you were doing, photostating, filing, indexing, writing, it was there playing in the background. It was, you know, we didn't have a radio or anything, we just listened to the Ripper tape day in, day out.
In Castletown Working Men's Club to this day, the bar is strictly segregated. Women are only permitted in one corner. For men and women here, the Ripper connection sowed suspicion and fear. Police questioned everyone.
Every time you answer a question, it's yes. For example, they said to me, do you travel away? And I said, yes, from time to time. Do you go to Yorkshire? Yes. Do you drive a Ford? Yes. And everything. And by this time you're thinking, hang on, is it me? And of course, with police all over the village, it was a frightening time for everybody.
I mean, they could have picked on you, and what could you have done about it? I couldn't remember where I was that particular week. I mean, I was in Bradford as it happened. If they had said, you're the Ripper, how would you prove you're not the Ripper?
It was horrible when you had them knocking at your door and questioning your husband, and you used to be terrified, thinking could it be him, or you used to suspect everybody.
I mean, if it was supposed to be somebody writing these letters in Castledown, was he in Castledown? Walking about, I mean, made you frightened to go out on the night.
Only 5,000 people lived in Castletown, yet nobody recognised the voice.
I'm Jack. I see you are still having your look catching me.
Nobody identified the man who sent the letters and the tape.
You are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago.
The failure came as a great surprise for the dialect expert Stanley Ellis and his Leeds University colleague Jack Windsor Lewis.
It can't be much good.
We were quite sure that its dialect characteristics and its personal characteristics were such that he would be instantly recognised, and therefore he would be found. We were amazed when he wasn't found.
Even if you do get near, I'll probably top myself first.
It could be that it was a member of your family and you didn't want to grass on them, that sort of thing.
And you've also got to remember that this whole community did not want the murderers to be from them. And they couldn't believe that all these murders that were carrying on in Yorkshire had anything to do with the northeast of England.
Well, it's been nice chatting to you, George. Yours, Jack the Ripper.
George Oldfield, Assistant Chief Constable, taunted personally by the voice, was still sure the tape and letters had to have come from the Ripper. He was wrong, with tragic consequences. 150 officers had now spent a full year checking cars in the red light districts. A black Sunbeam Rapier was seen twice in Leeds, once in Manchester, and 36 times in Bradford. The police national computer revealed the name of its registered keeper, a Mr. Peter Sutcliffe. In July 1979, Detective Sergeant Andrew Laptew was still a constable. He was sent on a routine assignment to interview the driver.
We were always told that it could be the next door you knock upon, the next phone call you get. So you went to that house with an open mind.
The next door DC Laptew knocked on was number 6 Garden Lane, Heaton, in Bradford. Home of Peter Sutcliffe, a man of 33 with a Bradford accent, and his wife Sonia.
They seemed an odd couple. He was a lorry driver, she was a teacher. He was very quiet, she was quite vociferous. The thing that struck me more than anything was the uncanny resemblance to the Marilyn Moore photo fit. The victim who survived, there was an uncanny resemblance. I had bad feelings about the man. He had too many uncanny links with what we knew. There was a gap in his teeth. His shoe size fitted the suspect's shoe size. Both my colleague and myself, when we left the house, sort of looked at each other and said, we're not happy with this man. There was something sinister about him, something weird. And there's always your own particular irrational gut feeling, if you like, about a person. Well, I submitted a report about our suspicions. We got the report typed up and we got it forwarded to the incident room, and we brought it to the attention of the senior investigating officer.
The senior investigating officer was Detective Superintendent Dick Holland.
I don't specifically remember the Laptew report. It passed through me along with many, many others, hundreds of thousands of others, and unfortunately I filed it.
Peter Sutcliffe had the wrong accent and the wrong handwriting.
It's something I will have to live with for the rest of my life. It shouldn't have been filed. I wish I hadn't done it, but you can't turn the clock back. It was one of those things, but I must say that at that time, no one had seen all the information on Sutcliffe coordinated into one file. We were using a manual system. There were no computers of the type that there are today. We live in a computer age, and everything about Sutcliffe would be on one file. It never was.
Sutcliffe had now been interviewed 5 times. Crucial information about his earlier record lay scattered in different police files. Information DC Laptew did not know.
The things I didn't know about Peter Sutcliffe when we knocked on his door was that he had a conviction for going equipped for theft. When I made an inquiry with the records office, all I got was a note saying he had a conviction going equipped for theft. It did not say that the conviction was going equipped for theft with a hammer.
That conviction was in 1969, so the police took this mugshot 6 years before the first murder. In the weeks after DC Laptew put in his report, the killer used his hammer again, in Bradford. The Ripper had given up on red light districts. Now he prowled anywhere young women could be found out alone after dark. His 11th victim was a student. She had a night out with friends in a pub close to the university. She walked home 200 yards up the main street. He killed her, yards from her own back door. Her name was Barbara Leach. She was 20 years old and came from Northamptonshire. He hit her over the head with a hammer and stabbed her 8 times. 11 murders in 4 years. Once again, Detective Superintendent Dick Holland was summoned back from a family holiday.
I came into the office still in my holiday clothes and came to the scene here to get the picture as early as possible from the discovery of the body. She'd obviously been attacked, and the body placed under the steps in the corner with rubbish and old carpet piled around her. She was slumped in a sitting position with her clothing disturbed and blood running down from the head injuries.
Police faced mounting criticism. For the first time, the Ripper had killed a university student, a clever girl, a middle-class girl. Women took to the streets in protest at 4 years of terror.
Personally, I took the criticism very badly. Anybody mentioned to me, if anybody didn't know I was a police officer and said, oh, it's about time they caught this Ripper, what do the police think they're doing? I used to jump down the throats. I could be quite nasty about it. But at the end of the day, the people doing this inquiry were human beings with human feelings, the human frailties, their own vulnerabilities. But on top of all this, they had a job to do. And to be criticised and kicked in the teeth for it as well, it was hard to take, yeah.
Overwork and hard drinking had already ruined the health of George Oldfield.
He was a man of few words, and he could be a very harsh boss. who would keep you going all night, sometimes till 4 or 4:30 in the morning, and expect you back on briefing at 9 o'clock the same morning. But he drove himself just as hard and stuck at it the same. I suppose you can say that in retrospect. It told on his health, and I think eventually killed him.
George Oldfield recovered from his first heart attack, but his time in charge of Britain's biggest manhunt was over. A 100 miles northeast of Leeds, one police officer began to have doubts about whether the Sunderland letters and tape really came from the Ripper. David Zackerson was then a detective inspector in the Northumbrian force.
I began to have doubts when I looked at the 3 letters before me. There was nothing in those letters which immediately shot out, you know, that this fella has to be the killer.
The unpublished full text of the letters had been circulated confidentially inside the police. Detective Inspector Zackerson examined the wording and found clear similarities with an earlier case, the still unsolved Whitechapel murders. The original Jack the Ripper killed 5 women in the East End of London in 1888. In that case, too, the police received letters. 1888. That joke about the leather apron gave me fits. 1979. That photo in the paper gave me fits.
We were left with the fact that the Ripper had no real originality. He was reading up on a man who was operating almost a century beforehand. Does some psychopath who gets gratification through murders really need that sort of thing? Does he need to borrow the phraseology?
Another clue. Police knew Vera Millward had been a patient in the hospital where she was murdered. Funny, said the letter writer. The lady mentioned something about being in hospital before I stopped her whoring ways.
We'd been told this was something which only the killer would know. When we were researching our newspaper articles, bang, there's the Daily Mail, obviously published before the letter was sent, detailing fully that Vera Millward had been in the same hospital for some sort of operation. So we'd lost what really was a vital linchpin. I want to make a distinction here, that it was quite right to publish the letters and tapes. Quite right. That was a line of inquiry. It should never have been a point of elimination. And that to me was fatal.
Language experts Stanley Ellis and Jack Windsor Lewis also began to have doubts.
At the end of September 1979, I wrote to the CID in Bradford and I sent a letter headed The Ripper Tape and Letters, and in that I said, for the past few days I've been troubled by the thought that we may be hunting a writer-recorder who is not in fact the Ripper murderer. And I continued to believe that, and was very troubled that the letters were always, then the tape were always taken into account as if they must be from the murderer.
For instance, at one time they had a bulletin circulated to all policemen which said, don't waste time on anybody who hasn't got a Geordie accent. And that was ridiculous as far as we were concerned. The accent was a red herring as far as we were concerned.
Watch your front, watch and react.
But nothing could convince West Yorkshire that the letters and tape came from a hoaxer. Not even what happened 12 days after the death of Barbara Leach to PC Keith Mount in Sunderland.
I was brainwashed with that voice, brainwashed with it. I knew it better than my own voice. I was in the office by myself, and then the phone went for the millionth time. So I picked up my pen, and there was a pad by the phone. Picked it up. Police Instant Room, Sunderland, can I help you? And then this voice came on, and I thought, well, shit, this is the Ripper. This is the man. And the hairs on the back of my head stood up. And he's just saying, tell him it's a hoax, the tape's a hoax.
The hoax had disappeared. He's never been caught. Yet West Yorkshire police stuck to their belief that the killer had a northeastern accent. Frustrated detectives began to re-examine old leads. 2 years earlier, when Jean Jordan was killed in Manchester, police had found a brand new £5 note in her handbag. They failed to trace who had given it to her. Manchester police now tried again and made a crucial breakthrough. They managed to narrow down the list of workers whose pay packet could have included that note from 8,000 people to just 241. After 4.5 years, the hunters had their quarry within reach because lorry driver Peter Sutcliffe was employee number 76 on that list. Manchester police asked West Yorkshire to check all 241 names in their files.
When the list of 241 went to the Major Incident Room, it came back insofar as Sutcliffe was concerned, no trace. Now, when we looked at this as a review team, we did our best to identify what had gone wrong. It was impossible to ascertain accurately what had gone wrong. It had either been mistakenly searched, and Sutcliffe had been missed even though he was in the indices, but probably, his papers were out of the manual system without the card being in the manual system to say that his papers were out.
A simple clerical error, uncovered much later when Sir Lawrence Byford officially investigated what went wrong. Massive card indexes were the only source of information on 11 unsolved murders. And Peter Sutcliffe's details were mistakenly split up on 4 different index cards. In the first few weeks of the new year, 1980, Peter Sutcliffe was interviewed for the 7th, 8th and 9th times. That summer, he was stopped for speeding and arrested for being drunk in charge. The arresting officer checked with the Ripper incident room and was informed that Peter Sutcliffe had been eliminated from the inquiry. He killed again in August. The body of the 12th victim was found in a garden in a leafy suburb of Leeds. Her name was Marguerite Walls. She was 47 years old and a civil servant. On Bonfire Night, 1980, 5 years after the first murder, the Ripper went back to Huddersfield. He'd killed there before. The 18-year-old prostitute, Helen Ritka, murdered in the red light district. This time, he chose an ordinary housing estate. His victim, a teenage mother. She'd walked 100 yards to the shops for a packet of cigarettes and was on her way home to her baby and her boyfriend. Her name was Teresa Sykes. She was 16 years old, and she survived.
When you're 16 and you don't even think about it, which I appreciate I didn't. It's like it can never happen to me. I mean, even when I knew that it was about, it was what happened to me. It was just before I got to the lamppost up there, and then once I got under the light, I looked round and he was behind me, and I looked at him and he looked at me, and it was sort of like a couple of seconds, and he walked off down the path. And then obviously I thought, yeah, it's alright, it's gone. And I carried on walking, and I'm walking down here. I got like just past the second light and noticed a shadow on the floor. Didn't hear anything, just the shadow, so I knew it was still there. But I still got the feeling that there was somebody behind me. And when I saw the shadow, that's what really frightened me. I couldn't run. Couldn't do half the things that you always think, yeah, you can do, and I couldn't do it. So I grabbed hold of the gate, and that is when he hit me. I started screaming. I can remember screaming, and then I can remember just hearing footsteps running. And then the next door neighbour came out. And Mum took me in the house. And I still didn't realise I was really hurt until I actually got in and saw blood. How close to home were you? My home's there, I can see it from here.
Detective Superintendent Dick Holland lived only a mile and a half away.
We were only minutes behind him with dogs on the scene pretty quickly. He ran down here and somehow got it. We don't know exactly his route into the back alley, but the dogs picked him up, picked up scent in the back alley. And in fact, my daughter at that time was living there, next to the passage, right under the scene. So incidents like that do have a personal touch. It's frustrating every time you get near to a criminal and just miss them. All the luck ran on his side right up to when he was finally caught. That was the first time the carts fell our way.
The Yorkshire Ripper disappeared through the warren of terraced houses. In 5.5 years, this was the closest Dick Holland ever came to his quarry. "12 days after his attack on Teresa Sykes, Peter Sutcliffe killed for the last time. He was in Leeds. He bought a fast food supper in Headingley. Around 9:20, a bus from the city centre brought a young student home from an evening class. Sutcliffe followed her. Her name was Jacqueline Hill. She was 20 years old and hoped to become a probation officer.
I have always held the view that this man will continue to kill until he is caught. No woman is safe whilst he's at large.
George Oldfield was back at work after his heart attack. Jacqueline Hill, the 13th victim, was buried in her home village of Ormsby near Middlesbrough. The Prime Minister was furious. Mrs. Thatcher had a daughter who'd been a student. Colleagues had to restrain her from going to Leeds herself to take personal charge of the investigation. Chief Constable Ronald Gregory bowed to the inevitable. He accepted help from outside his own force.
Well, I think the time had come. You might say the time had come a few murders ago, but it's certainly come for a rethink about the whole investigation.
I went to see Mr. Gregory following the Jacqueline Hill murder, and I suggested to him that the time had come, having regard to his overload of police officers who were doing the Ripper case, to bring in a think tank comprising some of the best brains I could think of who've been involved in serious murder investigations in Scotland Yard and elsewhere. And he agreed to that, and between us we in fact selected the team.
A fortnight after the death of Jacqueline Hill, Byford's super squad arrived in Leeds to spend 17 days reviewing the case. There were one scientist and a group of senior policemen, including the future Chief Constable of Strathclyde, Andrew Sloane.
It's easy to be dramatic, and terms like shell-shocked easily come to mind. But people who I knew from the past, who had been good, diligent detectives, who worked very hard and very skillfully, they had this sort of air about them that they were almost punch drunk by banging their heads against the wall of this inquiry.
Another member of the super squad was one of Britain's top forensic scientists, Professor Stuart Kind. His scientific expertise allowed the super squad to tell West Yorkshire police almost exactly where the Ripper lived.
So what I did was this. I drew a graph rather like this, and on this axis I started at 6 p.m. and finished at...
Using skills learned in the war as an RAF navigator, Professor Kind plotted the location, the time of night, and the time of year of each Ripper attack.
But I did find that when making allowance for the variation in the length of day, that the late flyers in each case were in the Leeds and Bradford area. I came up with a theory that the Ripper probably lived in the in Bradford area, and possibly in Manningham or Shipley.
Manningham and Shipley are only 3 miles apart. Peter Sutcliffe's home stood between them. A force of 5,000 police officers had worked 2 million man-hours. Swamped by work, the police effort was now hopelessly compromised by mistakes. The 9 interviews which failed to identify the killer, the criminal records which didn't mention a hammer, the belief that the Ripper had a northeastern accent. In 5.5 years, the killer had made only one mistake, when he left a traceable £5 note in a victim's handbag. Then, in December 1980, Peter Sutcliffe went to a breaker's yard in Huddersfield. Here he made his second and critical mistake. He stole a set of number plates and fitted them on his car. Christmas 1980. 13 women were dead. Rumours that the killer would strike again kept many women off the wintry streets. So the Yorkshire Ripper left West Yorkshire and drove south. It was January the 2nd, 1981, and 2 officers from the South Yorkshire Police were on routine night patrol.
I was a probationer at the time and out on patrol with Sergeant Ring. He'd asked me if I'd done a prostitute file, process one for court, and I told him no, so he says, well, we'll go and see if we can find one. He drove onto Melbourne Avenue, which is this road, and as we were approaching Light Trade's house, he said, there's one there, just pointed. We drove straight up the driveway and parked directly in front of the Rover car that they were in. I got out of the car, approached the driver, asked him his name and address. He actually gave me false details. Sergeant Ring approached the female occupant of the car, had a conversation with them. We then did a PNC check on the vehicle, the number plates that were displayed. That came back as a Skoda car, and obviously the one that they were in was a Rover. I then arrested the driver of the vehicle, who I later found out was, when we got back to the station, was Peter William Sutcliffe.
Sutcliffe said he needed to urinate, so the two Sheffield policemen let him go in a corner. And then they took him back to their police station under arrest for stealing number plates.
He was very agitated and apprehensive, even when you were talking about simplest of things. I got the impression that he wanted to get out of the police station as quickly as possible. On and off, I spent about 8 hours with him in this room. There was a photo fit of the Yorkshire Ripper on the filing cabinet in here, which depicted a man with black hair, beard, moustache, very much like Peter Sutcliffe, actually. Very good photo fit.
They had a suspect who wore size 7 boots and had a gap in his teeth. But they had no real evidence. Next day, the two Sheffield policemen went back to the place where they'd made the arrest. They looked behind the oil tank where they'd let their suspect urinate. And there, one of them found what they'd missed before, a hammer.
There was a bit of conversation as to who it could belong to. He was saying that it could belong to the handyman, because there was an oil tank at the side of where it was. And that's when I stood on the wall and shone the torch down and said, well, the hammer might belong to him, but who does the knife belong to? And after that, we knew that the person we'd arrested was the man who was commonly known as the Yorkshire Ripper.
Confronted with the evidence, Peter Sutcliffe now confessed to killing 13 women. The next policeman to visit the house in Garden Lane was Detective Superintendent Dick Holland.
I decided to go and see Mrs. Sutcliffe and to have a look round his house. The first thing I saw was a wooden block with kitchen knives in, the type of block with slots through. It was obvious that the second largest knife of the set was the one I had covered in clear polythene in my hand, the one that had been found behind the oil tank at Sheffield. I wanted a search of the area where I would find tools, and I searched the garage. This peculiar type of hacksaw was hanging just inside the garage door. When I got back to the police station with the hacksaw in a polythene bag to preserve the scientific evidence, one of the interrogating team came out of the interview room and said, "Boss, he's just told us that he went back to Manchester with a hacksaw and tried to cut the head off Jordan, but the hacksaw wasn't big enough." I said, "I know, I've got the hacksaw." Now, the Detective Chief Inspector, who had not been privy to this information, the hacksaw we were looking at, looked in amazement and said, "Fucking hell, boss, you kept that dark."
The use of the hacksaw on Jean Jordan was a gruesome detail that only the most senior officers knew. From the Chief Constable of West Yorkshire, congratulations.
It was common knowledge, I think, that Mr. Gregory said that whichever officer arrested Peter Sutcliffe would be promoted, no matter what rank. But obviously I'm not in the West Yorkshire Police, I'm in the South Yorkshire Police. I hadn't passed my exam, I was still a probationer, so it never happened.
A man is charged with a Ripper murder.
the chief constable could not conceal his relief. Ronald Gregory announced the arrest to the world's press, with George Oldfield at his side.
We are absolutely delighted with developments at this stage. Absolutely delighted.
Can you all smile?
Really delighted. George is delighted as well.
You can imagine how I felt. I was absolutely stunned. I was totally gutted, because I remembered interviewing the man, I remembered my suspicions, my colleagues' suspicions, and what we'd written about him. And I thought what might have been, what things could have been so different, not for my own personal satisfaction, but for the relatives of those victims.
A crowd of 2,000 people greeted Peter Sutcliffe's first court appearance. The accused was the oldest of 6 children in a mill worker's family from Bingley in West Yorkshire. His childhood was unremarkable, and he left school at 15. He was 23 at the time of his arrest, for going equipped for theft with a hammer. The young Sutcliffe worked for a year as a gravedigger at the Victorian Cemetery in Bingley. In later conversations with defense psychiatrists, he claimed that his killing career was inspired here, when he heard the voice of God instructing him to rid the streets of prostitutes. The Old Bailey jury did not believe him. On the 22nd of May 1981, the jury delivered its majority verdict. The Ripper was bad, not mad. Guilty of 13 murders and 7 attempted murders. Sonia Sutcliffe's husband received 20 life sentences. And the recriminations began.
My inquiry was not there to produce scapegoats so much as to produce the lessons for the future.
Sir Lawrence Byford was instructed by the government to investigate what had gone wrong. He found the officers and their filing system were hopelessly overwhelmed. The Byford team asked for all 77 photofits provided by victims and witnesses to be collected together in one room.
We walked in through the door, and all the pictures are up on the wall, and it was like a blow in the stomach almost to recognize immediately that there was Peter Sutcliffe looking at us from these assembled pictures. We were aware, of course, we had the immense advantage of hindsight, and that they had been put up like that for the first time, but they also included quite a number of the assaults in which Sutcliffe was suspected. But even without that knowledge, it was obvious that there was a dark-haired, bearded man appearing again and again.
Their conclusion? The deaths of Barbara Leach, Marguerite Walls, and Jacqueline Hill could have been prevented.
That hits very hard professionally and makes me feel very, very sad. And also, it made us absolutely determined that there should be no repetition of this sort of thing.
Today, the Ripper incident room in Leeds is home to 2 current murder investigations.
And I don't know whether they've lifted anything off it, but nobody's done anything with the inside of the camera.
Officers all over Britain work according to principles laid down by the Byford Report. Better training for senior officers, standardized filing systems, and computers.
I'm no computer expert, but I said to the experts, look, I want you to think of the Ripper inquiry where there were in excess of 600,000 statements, manual index cards and so on and so forth. And I want to be able to put my finger on a computer terminal and in those 600,000 to come out on the terminal as a printout any mention of a man with a dog. Can you do that for me? And the answer was, yes, we think we can.
D-O-G, dog.
The National Computer System arrived in 1986. It runs a powerful database, named after Sherlock Holmes. Detective Sergeant Andrew Laptew became the resident Holmes expert at his station in Bradford.
They often come up and say, which button tells me who's done it? Well, it won't do that, but it will point you in the right direction, and it's a valuable tool in any major inquiry.
A serial killer only becomes a serial killer because he's cute enough to avoid detection early by the police. But I like to think that with the advent of the Holmes system, with the new procedures and the compatibility of major incident rooms, one force with another, the chances of the serial killer getting away with it have been considerably lessened since the Ripper investigation.
Peter Sutcliffe is now 53. He's locked away in Broadmoor Secure Hospital, where another inmate attacked him with a screwdriver and blinded him in one eye. But Sutcliffe was not the only man to be punished as a result of the Yorkshire Ripper case.
We didn't anticipate the degree of criticism that we got. They published their reports and senior officers were criticised. As a result of that, I and other officers were banished into uniform to different parts of the force. We were moved, it was said at the time, in my case, for career development. Career development with 20 months to go to pension. Obviously, that was an excuse for what was a political move with a small p. Mr. Oldfield was moved to become ACC support services. Nothing of a job, really. They control things like horses and dogs and the trivia of the police force. I felt sorry for him because he had worked to the stage of injuring his health. Then just got kicked out sideways as a result.
4 years later, George Oldfield died. Chief Constable Ronald Gregory retired in 1983 and now lives in Portugal. He sold his story to a newspaper for a reported £40,000, admitted personal responsibility for going public with the hoax letters and tape. The teenage mother, Teresa Sykes, slowly recovered from the 3 hammer blows to her head. Almost 20 years on, she's rebuilt her life and lives quietly in West Yorkshire with her youngest son.
I used to go up to the bedroom of a night, put wardrobe behind the door, put dressing table behind the door. I'd sleep with a knife under the pillow, which my mum used to go by me about. But that was the only thing that sort of like made me feel that bit safer. It took away my freedom. It took away a lot of my life. The night that he attacked me. And that I never get back. I'll never ever get it back.